Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much. I want to thank Jeff. I want to thank JD. I want to thank, I'm sure there's many other people involved, both in organizing and promoting this event. It's such a crucially important moment, obviously, in our American history, even absent some of these challenging issues that are arising with the coronavirus pandemic. And as Jeff correctly mentioned, some of the emerging concerning threats on our Bill of Rights and constitutional liberties. Even absent all of that, this would have been an important gathering, but I'm very honored to participate in it. Very excited about the potential that I think can emerge from any gathering of liberty-minded people. And I'm going to try today in a brief period of time to sort of give you a summary of some of the lessons I've learned in 30 years of political activism and public policy engagement, and particularly draw on a lot of the lessons and experiences as a co-founder and national leader and spokesperson in our Tea Party movement. Things that we've done well, things that we've done okay at, and things that, in my view, we could have done better at. Because I think, honestly, that sort of honest self-evaluation is always crucial to being, effective in this undertaking. Just a quick summary of the Tea Party movement for those of you who might be new to political involvement or new to political engagement. In 2009, Barack Obama had just been elected president of the United States. He assumed the presidency with a perceived mandate with a very radicalized left of center agenda that was opposed by tens and tens of millions of Americans. He had a media that was glamorizing his candidacy and his presidency and not covering him at all like they cover this current president. There was almost no scrutiny or critical coverage of his presidency. In fact, in the opening days, it was almost treated like a monarchy, and it was like the welcoming of the king and queen. In Congress, which would have been the logical place to have seen some political and public policy opposition and alternative visions for the country, we had Nancy Pelosi then as Speaker of the House with her radical and very Obama-aligned agenda. And in the Senate, we had Harry Reid, no longer in the Senate, but he was also a very Obama-aligned Democrat from the state of Nevada, since retired. So there was no conservative representative in any leadership position within either the legislative or executive branch of government. He had a cabinet that was very radicalized. He had the courts, the federal courts, even though they continued to have a very left of center, revisionist and activist inclination, at least on the federal court level, were even worse back then, frankly. I think our great 45th president of the United States, who I supported on day one, has done a decent job in really starting to correct some of those issues, but it was even worse back then. And then on top of that, we had, academia was very aligned with the administration. And most disturbingly, on our side, while we have very well-funded institutions that purport to represent the conservative political agenda, most of them are based in the nation's capital. They're very insular. They're not easy to get involved with. They didn't really represent at the time, still don't really, an opportunity for individuals to become politically engaged or engaged in their communities. The only time many of us hear from them are, to ask for donations and things like that. I've worked inside the Beltway, and I've worked in a grassroots capacity. I'm one of the few people, I think, from a conservative perspective, who's worked, in the White House, in Republican administrations, and within these very institutions that I'm referring to, and then also worked, obviously, in the founding of this movement. Now, how did the movement come about? Well, you take the broader sort of political culture of 2009 that I just described, and you realize that well over half the country, not half the country, over half the country, did not subscribe to the viewpoint, did not subscribe to that direction, did not want to see the country moving in those areas, wanted to get involved, and felt, frankly, a little guilty that had they been more involved in that 2008 election and in the battle of ideas and in their community political involvement, that we wouldn't have ended up in that situation. We're looking very much for an opportunity to get involved and to make a difference. And I really have nothing but immense respect for that. I think it's the most admirable trait of the American people. It's what made this country. It's what established this country. It was behind the American Revolution. It's been behind, every great initiative. It was a sentiment behind the Civil Rights Initiative that was so crucially important, and it was behind the Tea Party Revolution of 2009. So we originally, a bunch of us had been in touch by conference calls and remotely. None of us, it was very similar to this kind of event today in the sense that a lot of us sort of instinctually knew that we looked at the world and looked at the country with some of the same concerns and the same objectives, but we hadn't historically worked together. We didn't have, kind of the relationship of trust you would traditionally want to have in political undertaking of this sensitivity, but we instinctually knew that we all did not like the direction of the country, and we also knew that there was not really the avenues available. We certainly weren't being provided with the Republican National Committee or any of the official, establishment organizations for people to become involved and to push back on this direction that the country, had been moving. So, as some of you may or may not have heard, there was a kind of rant on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange one day, broadcast on CNBC. I had managed investor relations for a Fortune 1000 NASDAQ traded company, and I'd gotten in the habit of watching CNBC in the morning. And the CNBC reporter was Rick Santelli. He was talking about the housing bailout of 2008, 2009, and he got up and said, we're ready for a Tea Party rebellion, and how many people would, support this? And all these, guys on the mercantile floor, basically cheered and applause. And I kind of had the idea, and I was unbelievably not alone because we had some group chats going on, and we said, hey, did anybody see this Santelli ran on CNBC this morning? By this time, it had kind of been online. It was on video. And we very much benefited, as we're benefiting today, from the internet era, the fact that we can bring people together who may not otherwise have known each other, may not be geographically proximate. We decided, we were all kind of inspired by it. We're like, let's get a conference call together and just kind of talk about that moment and if there's anything in there. So we got this call together. It was 12, 15 of us. I was the only one on the call who had ever worked in politics or public policy or any management capacity. But there were really some very passionate people on there who really wanted to do something. They were stay-at-home moms, there were airline stewardesses, there were people that worked in blue-collar jobs, but they all shared a passion that we needed to organize and do something. So we're like, okay, what do we do? Well, we kind of centered in and agreed, and I would say that one of the lessons throughout this entire movement is the challenge of consensus building. We're all individualists. We believe in individual rights. But one of the lessons I've learned is that our effectiveness is rooted in collaboration, cohesion, sticking together, supporting each other, not being selfish, and compromise sometimes, because we all come from different experiences. We're all like on this call today because we've had different experiences. I had experiences early in my life, literally in my late teens, that drove me to identify as a liberty-minded conservative, and I'm sure that all of you have had, spiritual or political or public policy or community or other experiences that have led us here. And so it's inevitable we're all going to look at things not identically, but we do have the common denominator of all sharing a belief in our founding principles and in defending our constitutional liberties, and hopefully, supporting other individuals within the movement, including political figures who are aligned with that. So we agreed that the first thing we would do in our Tea Party movement was to organize a series of rallies around the country on tax day, which seemed reasonable, around a very simple agenda that we laid out on the call. And my position at the time that I articulated was that we needed to have an agenda that was cohesive, that was contrary, that represented the contrarian view we had to the establishment political world that existed in the Obama administration, and that many tens, hopefully tens of millions of Americans could ultimately come to embrace. So, meaning like the more we dived into the individuals and the particulars, the more difficult this would become to attract broad audiences. So I said, look, three principles here that I think are at the core of what we all stand for. Number one is adherence to the Constitution, meaning this founding document is genius, it's brilliant. It represents the rule of law, it represents our fundamental liberties, it represents in many respects what makes this country different from other countries of the world. Everyone agreed with that. I said number two is limited government. That's inherent in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, but it was very much an issue that needed to be articulated at that time, when the position of the Obama administration and their allies in Congress was the government can do anything, do everything, was responding to every crisis with a government solution, had frankly a great deal of disdain for the private sector, great disdain for business people, great disdain for community organizations, nonprofit organizations, leaders of faith. All of these were individuals that we saw as kind of the foundation, and we continue to see as the foundation of American society. A government that serves those people, not vice versa, as being core to all of this. And then the final position was taxed enough already, the acronym TEA, that the country was being overtaxed. When you added up the cumulative effect of federal income taxes, of payroll taxes, of state taxes, city taxes, municipal taxes, real estate taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, the burden on the American people just is extraordinary. I mean, not a few Americans are paying the lion's share of their earnings to various governmental entities, which becomes absurd. It's a disincentive for people to seek out jobs. It's created a culture of animosity toward hard work and hard labor, where they feel that's being punished or not sufficiently rewarded. And it was, very much affecting our economy in a negative way. I mean, government money in the hands of the American people is almost always better spent than money in the hands of our government. And there was universal embrace on those three premises. So April 15th, we picked, obviously, Tax Day, to organize these rallies. We thought that we realistically, with a lot of hard work, could pull off about 150 of these that would cover every major metropolitan area in the country, and essentially create kind of a one-day news story that the American people were pushing back on the Obama agenda and had organized politically this day. As soon as the word got out that we were organizing these Tax Day Tea Party rallies, the movement just snowballed. We would get individuals calling in saying, well, what do you mean you have a rally in San Antonio, but you don't have one in El Paso, or you don't have one in Austin? We're like, well, let's organize one there. So we found ourselves between the February organizing call and the April 15th rollout of these events, finding that the number of these events doubled, tripled, quintupled as the word got out. People wanted to be a part of it. They saw the importance of it. They saw it as an opportunity to express their passion. There's a lot of psychological sentiment that I think goes into that. Part of it is, an idea of validation of their viewpoints. They were sitting at home watching a world and a country move in a direction that they did not support, that they opposed. And it was reassuring and encouraging for them to get out and to find out that they were not alone in those viewpoints, that they were not extremists in believing that we had to adhere to the Constitution, that we had to limit the size and scope of our federal government, and that, between raising taxes and cutting taxes, we had to cut them. Those are not right-wing ideas. Those are not ideas on the fringe of the American political spectrum. Those are ideas, and I believe we need to present them that are centerpiece, they're centrist viewpoints. They're at the core of the founding of the country. They're inherent in all of our Constitution and rule of law. They are at the core of what's made this the greatest country in the world. And the abandonment of those three principles, in my judgment, would be the downfall of this nation. So the simplicity of our messaging was a big part of our early success, that people could identify with it, that we didn't put up a whole bunch of policy specifics that would serve as an objection for people to get involved. So people who may have identified as traditional conservatives, they supported the Tea Party movement. People who identified as spiritual conservatives supported the Tea Party movement. People who identified as libertarians supported the Tea Party movement. People who identified as constitutionalists supported the Tea Party movement. People who identified as states' rights advocates, who felt, that many functions being conducted by the federal government belonged on the states, supported the Tea Party movement. So that was key to the growth of it. Of course, April 15, 2009 comes, and we have this huge event, well covered throughout the country. It turned out, I think, over 1,000 rallies and a seven-figure number of people that came out that day. And frankly, we did all this. It would be very revisionist of me, and it would be insincere and untrue of me to say it was all because of our impeccably well-managed national organizational skills. The reality is we did an okay job. I don't want to say we did a bad job. We all did our best with what we had in front of us, but it was far from perfect. It was the passion of the American people and their desire to become involved that really was the ultimate deciding factor and the ultimate reason that we had such a successful day. And I believe that sentiment, and I say this by way of encouraging this emerging organization and all of those of you who seek to do constructive things within it, to realize that sentiment still exists in this country. If anything, it may even be stronger, because I think people have seen now through the Tea Party movement that grassroots activism can prove so hugely important. So what we originally set out to do, which was this one day of events, steamrolled. The day ended. It was in every newspaper, every broadcast outlet across the country. And the logical question we all faced was, okay, what do we do now? We can't just let this momentum disappear. No one wanted to see that happen. They all were asking, what do we do now? How do we follow up? And, so we had both national and local organizations that began to develop. They held regular meetings. They invited in speakers. We very soon embraced that there was a political dimension to this, that we would recruit and vet and potentially support candidates for federal, state, and local offices. And, to summarize our accomplishments, which in my judgment, and I said this to Jeff, I believe on one of his conversations with Jeff podcasts, was that we changed the direction of the country and the world over the last decade. Now, how did we do that? Number one, 2010, we had over 60 self-identified Tea Party candidates get elected in the Tea Party, what's now famously called the Tea Party wave of elections in 2010. We fired Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House and took control of the House. I said from the very beginning, as one of the leading spokespeople at that time, that our goal for the Tea Party movement was nothing short of taking back the country. It was a very bold statement. I always felt a little nervous saying about it because I very much want to be a person of my word. But I knew that's what the people wanted to do. I knew that's what it would take to organize a movement, the magnitude of what needed to be done for us to have the effect that we wanted to have within the country. And, frankly, as President Trump, I think, has even said, sometimes focusing on big goals isn't a whole lot much more difficult than focusing on small goals. They still have the same organizational needs, the same participation needs, the same work needs. So we shot big. We've set very big goals. But the success and what makes the Tea Party movement iconic was we did execute on it. So 2010, we take back the House of Representatives. Now, how important is that? Well, it completely blocked the legislative agenda of the Obama administration, meaning anything that they then wanted to accomplish had to be done through executive order. Sadly, they were able to do a lot of things, some of which may have fallen outside of the parameters of the Constitution, to advance their agenda. But as far as passing legislation, we held that at bay within the House of Representatives, much frankly as like Nancy Pelosi destructively has been doing to this president. We came back in 2014 and we said we would take back the Senate. We did that. We fired Harry Reid, the since retired Democrat leader from the state of Nevada, and put in place the Republican leadership. Importantly, in that 2014 race, we again identified individuals who ran as Tea Party candidates. And some of these are iconic figures now in American conservatism. Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz ran as a Tea Party conservative in the state of Texas. Rand Paul ran as a Tea Party conservative in the state of Kentucky. Mike Lee ran as a Tea Party conservative in the state of Utah. And Marco Rubio ran as a Tea Party conservative in the state of Florida. So they took the organizational structure that we had put in place. They reached out to these many organizations and to us on a national level, expressed support for our agenda, admiration for our organizing and political and public policy initiatives, and ran affiliated with us and got elected. And those four individuals are crucially important, not simply because they helped us take back the Senate in 2014, which was obviously very important, but they also have emerged as thought leaders within our movement. I have a great deal of respect for all four of those guys. Now, the least covered component of this were two other facts in presidential elections, one negative, one positive. The negative was 2012. In my judgment, you may recall Obama, despite all the positive media coverage he received, his support in the country was pretty comparable to what President Trump's is now. And I believed that he was, in fact, beatable in that 2012 election. Sadly, we reached out to the Romney campaign, and we didn't get much response from them. We didn't get any indication, frankly, that they wanted to work with us. And, they were driven by the traditional Republican establishment, consultant types, highly compensated, presented like they knew all the answers. And, unbelievably, they, thought they knew better. And I think the election of 2012 proved that they didn't, because, there were like at least 1 to 2 million Republicans who potentially could have come out that day who did not come out to vote, who, had they come out to vote, would have swayed that election in a few states in the right direction, and there would have been no second term of Obama. And then in 2016, importantly, this isn't widely known, but President Trump actually spoke at Tea Party rallies throughout those periods. He gave a great speech in 2011 in Boca Raton, Florida, which is, I believe, on YouTube, which I'd encourage all of you to go take a look at. He expressed support and admiration for what we were doing. And I think when you look at the tactics that he employed in the 2016 election, well, I would never take anything away from the president. He won this on his own through his agenda and through his persuasiveness. We at least had established that rally-based campaigning was a means of being successful, and also that the Republican establishment was not the only road toward achieving and winning in national elections. He utilized a good deal of those tactics, and as a result of that, emerged shockingly to many, but not much to us, as victorious. Because I knew, traveling around this country as I did for those 6 years, 7 years in Tea Party leadership, that there was a lot of frustration among working class Americans, particularly about our trade and immigration policies. They wanted to see these things changed, and they did not subscribe, and the American people still do not subscribe to this idea that the candidate who's sort of been around the longest, who's had the best resume, was necessarily the best person to lead in these trying times. Now, just one final point as I wrap up. I think coronavirus is, and I'm sure that other speakers have raised this beforehand. I have really just begun over the last 48 hours to realize that we're starting to see the emergence, possibly, of a new national grassroots movement. Part of it is Tea Party, some of the same Tea Party people. Some of it are Trump loyalists, and some of it are other, factor X. Yeah, I can't really describe who they are, but I think the concerns about this, how this is handled, is going to be a very legitimate issue over the next 90 days. My own view on it is this, and I'll just share it with you. I trust this president. I support this president. I believe he's going to make the right decisions for the American people. But this is not simply a federal government-driven decision on how to respond and when to reopen our economy. He has, and appropriately has, delegated much of this to the governors, and they are a mixed bag. Some of them are going to make exceptionally well-guided decisions and incrementally move toward reopening their economies. And some of them are, Michigan's an example. I think Ohio's an example. Virginia was an example. You've got Kentucky maybe as an example. A good number of other states that New Jersey's an example. I just was contacted today. Apparently someone who had organized a rally there recently was arrested by state police for violating the governor's distancing policies. These are raising really crucially important Bill of Rights and constitutional issues. And I think there's a balancing act to it. We have to be conscious as a movement that there is a threat, a real threat to the public health of the United States of America and to Americans. We've lost over 35,000 lives to date. That's in a matter of weeks. So we can't say there's no threat. That would be a misrepresentation. You'll have no credibility in your communities if you say that. You need to be cognizant of the fact that this is a real thing. It's a real threat. That said, this cannot be used by Democrats politically to stall the economy or to create a political dynamic that they feel will be advantageous going into this 2020 election. And sadly, we've learned over the last few years, there's not a whole lot that the progressive wing of the Democrat Party will not do to try to bring down this president, including completely fabricating impeachment initiatives and whatnot. So I believe those things do need to be highlighted. And I do think that within it lies the foundation and potential for the emergence of kind of a Tea Party 2.0 movement that can be immensely influential in this election year and in winning the hearts and minds of the American people for our liberty-minded agenda. And I really thank each and every one of you for participating. It's always a leap of faith to do it when you have a new organization, and taking the time today. And I'll participate in a little bit in our panel and share some further ideas on it. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, definitely.